Hello and welcome back to Inclusive Design 24, ID 24, and welcome if you are just joining us. ID 24 is brought to you by the Paciello Group with the kind support of Barclays and the Inclusive Centre for Inclusive Design in Australia. We really couldn't do this without you. If you want more information about those organisations, please do visit our website. Also, if you like a session, hit the like button, subscribe to the ID24 channel for future events and streams and videos. We've got some exciting plans ahead, and this will be the best way to find out what we're up to. I believe we still have the Centre of Inclusive Design in Australia streaming into their office, so hello guys, if you're still there. Don't forget that we love questions, so please do tweet us your questions using the ID24 hashtag, questions, comments, observations, anything you want to share with us. The best question or comment we will give a free JAWS 90-day license to. The YouTube channel has comments open, but we're not monitoring those, but do feel free to use those to comment there if you want to chat with other people. So with that, I will hand over to Russ Weakley, who is going to be talking about building an accessible autocomplete. Over to you, Russ. Thank you.
No worries. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this joyous YouTube channel. So today we're going to be talking, as discussed, about building accessible autocomplete. So for those that may not be aware of what we're talking about, autocomplete's a software function, and it provides suggestions based on input by the user. Now, for this presentation, we're going to focus mainly on search for autocomplete. And I've got a little diagram here to show one of those standard search functions. So it has an input, a clear button, a submit button, and then the auto suggest dropdown. So the aim here is just to provide some basic information to consider if you're interested in building your own accessible autocomplete search. Now, we're going to start by talking a bit about common UX patterns before we get into accessibility. So the first thing I want to talk about is there should be clear wording or visual indicators to describe the purpose of the search. So users, when they come to a search box, they may not know whether it's a search box for the entire site or an aspect of the site, or if it's for a specific function. So in this diagram, there's a clear label above the input box, and it says search towns in Australia. So immediately you know you're not searching the site, you're searching a particular type of function. Now, if there are additional information or instructions, they should be located as close as possible to that field. So in this diagram, we have a bit of extra information under the search box, and it says you can filter by town or by state. And the most important thing is that proximity, that it's very clear to users that it's directly related to that input. The next one we'll talk about is the placeholder attribute, and it's become really fashionable to use it instead of labels, but it really shouldn't be used in place of complex instructions. And the reason is, well, there's two reasons actually. The first one is it's often displayed in a very faint color, and that can fail WCAG guidelines. Now, you can use CSS to change that, but a lot of people don't, so it's in this very, very soft gray. And more importantly, if we're using it for complex instructions, as soon as the user comes into focus on that element and starts typing, those instructions are gone. And probably like a lot of you, I do user testing, and it's fascinating to watch users sometimes have to go back and clear the field in order to see the instructions again. So here's a diagram showing the label, and the instructions are done as a placeholder, and there's a big red cross there to say don't do this. The other thing is that the list of autocomplete suggestions could highlight the strings typed by the user. So in this case, the diagram shows that the user's typed in the characters AR, and in the drop-down list below, all of the suggestions coming up have AR highlighted as well. But it could be the opposite. You could use the highlight every string apart from the user types in. And in this case, the user's typed in AR, but all of the strings apart from that are highlighted. So the AR is actually softened and the rest of it is highlighted. Now, really, it doesn't matter particularly. Both these methods are beneficial. And what the reason is it helps people understand the relationship between what they're typing and the results being shown. Users should be able to quickly identify the string and how it's going to trigger the autocomplete. So, for example, does the search work on things like initial characters? So in this example, again, we're typing in AR, and you can see very clearly in this diagram that AR is the first string down the bottom. The other way around is that they could be doing any characters within a string. So in this case, the user's typed in ARA, and you'll see that there's a range of auto suggests below, and the ARA is highlighted, but it doesn't always appear at the beginning of the search result. Again, both these methods are completely cool. The most important thing, though, is to help users understand what's going on. Another thing is that auto suggests should be accurate. The suggestions, that is. So users shouldn't be presented with something that doesn't match something they typed. And you've probably seen this as much as I have. It's often frustrating or bizarre. A user types something in, and down below comes a series of suggestions that don't match anything they just typed. So it can be very confusing for some users. Another thing is that users should be able to clearly or easily clear the search form of a previously typed string. So in this diagram, we have a user has typed in some text, and over at the right, there's a function there where users can click it and clear the form. Now, in some cases, it's not necessary, but if users are typing in very complex information, it just allows them to quickly clear it, and it should jump back to the beginning of, and focus should return to that input. Now, ideally, there should also be some sort of clear submit action associated with the search. So in this diagram, at the very right, there's a little search submit function. In this case, it's got a little icon there of a magnifying glass, but fundamentally, it's very clearly a submit form, a submit for that input. Now, there are some people that build sites that have live filtering results, which means as you're typing, the search results are changing dynamically. And while that's sexy and amazing in some ways, it does have some problems. So when people are doing this, a lot of times the submit button seems redundant because search results are being delivered automatically as people are typing. But the problem with that is that if you're a screen reader user and you're typing into that submit form, you're not being made aware, unless it's done very well, that the search results are being delivered automatically below. So while it is definitely possible to work out ways to let users know as they're typing, a very simple method is just include a submit button anyway. And what it means is those types of users who need it can submit it, and then focus can jump down below. So that's a bit on user experience attached to autocomplete search. Now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty and accessibility, and we're going to talk first about keyboard only. So regardless of the method we're going to use, all of them should be keyboard accessible, meaning they should work for keyboard-only users. And the first thing we need to talk about is focus. So any web page or web app should have clear visual indicators to help keyboard users determine what elements in focus. Now, especially if you're using a really complex application where there's lots of different things that could receive focus. So this could be something like the default blue focus ring that's available in most browsers. And this diagram shows that focus ring. But you could use your own visual indicator. It really doesn't matter. And this diagram, the designer has chosen a large black dotted line to show that that element's in focus. The most important thing, though, is you should never turn off this sort of focus, the native focus, unless you're replacing it with something else. So here's a bit of CSS, and it's input : focus, and then the selector is that, and then the property and value are outline and none. So fundamentally, without doing anything else, you've just turned off all focus, and a keyboard user would not know where they are when they're on an input. And I've seen people do it across the entire site as well. So that's a bad practice. So ideally, the visual indicators should also be consistent across focusable elements. And I bring that up because I was just looking at a site the other day, and I was tabbing through it to see if it was keyboard accessible, and it was fantastic. But literally every component that I came onto, the designer had used a radically different way to show what was in focus. And it really struck me that as it was, each time I came to a different part, it was jarring experience because I was expecting some sort of focus methodology to be in place. Users shouldn't have to learn different visual indicators just to understand what's in focus. Next up, let's talk about keystrokes. Again, still on keyboard-only users. So keyboard-only users should be able to perform any of the following actions. The first one is they should be able to use the tab keystroke and move focus into the search input field from whatever they've been using before in the rest of the site. So in this diagram, they've tabbed in, and now the input box has a blue halo around it. They should be able to use the tab keystroke to move from that input to the clear button. So this diagram shows the focus is now shifted to the clear button. They should be able to use the enter keystroke to trigger the clear button. So when enter's selected, that should then wipe the form. And so what should happen is, when that triggers, the field should be cleared and focus should shift back to that field again. So this diagram shows that after the clear button has been selected, focus is now returned to a cleared input. Users should be able to use a tab keystroke to move from the focus from the clear button to the submit button. So in this diagram, focus shifts from clear to submit. They should be able to use the enter keystroke to trigger the submit button. Now these are standard button behaviors, so it should be a no-brainer, but regardless. So this diagram shows that the submit button should be triggered with an enter keystroke. Now, when the submit button has been triggered, focus should shift to the search results below. So in this diagram, after the user hits submit, the focus now shifts down below, and it should be announced so that screen reader users, etc., know that they're now on the search results area. Users should be able to use the down arrow keystroke to move focus from the search input field to the first item in a list of autocomplete suggestions. So in this diagram, the user uses a down arrow and moves from the input down to the first suggest item. Once they're in that, they should be able to use the up and down arrow keystrokes to navigate backwards and forwards through those suggestions. So in this diagram, we have an open auto suggest with a number of suggestions in there, and the diagram is showing that you can use the arrows up or down to move through that list. The other thing is that if there are a long list of auto-suggest items and you're using the arrow keystroke to move down or forward through that list, the scroll bar or the scrolling mechanism should be enabled so that they always find something that's actually in view. By that I mean that if you arrow down and the box isn't high enough and there's a long list, you don't want focus to disappear out of that auto-suggest box. It should trigger the scrolling mechanism. Now, this is slightly contentious because some people don't agree, but I think that users shouldn't be able to down arrow past the last suggest option. So in this example, we have a suggestion by the user, and there's a list of suggestions below, and it's suggesting you cannot use the arrow key, the down arrow key, to move forward out of that list. Now, some developers allow the down arrow keystroke to loop from the last suggestion directly back up to the top of the input. Now, I don't like it. And the reason is I've actually watched users doing this, and they get in this weird loop. In a couple of instances, I've seen users get quite confused. They don't realize that they've moved through a list of suggestions and gone back up to the input. And while you can explain it, when they're moving through things quickly, I've seen one user go through a loop 3 or 4 times before realizing they're actually in a loop. So I prefer to actually stop the down arrow at the bottom and not let them use a down arrow to continue. So in this diagram, it's showing that you should not be able to use the arrow key to jump from the last suggestion item back up to the input. Again, slightly contentious. If you disagree, tell us on Twitter or sue me. What else do we need to do? Oh yeah, however, if a user's in the auto-suggest list and the focus is down there and they use the up arrow, they should be able to move backwards through the auto-suggest items and up into the input. So in this example, they're using up arrow and move from the auto-suggest list back into the input. They should also be able to use the enter keystroke to select an autocomplete suggestion. So in this example, the user has chosen the town of Armidale, they should be able to hit enter, and that should then take them somewhere. And where should it go? Well, focus should shift back up to the search input field, and that should be announced to them. So in this diagram, the auto-suggest list now disappears, focus returns to the input, and that is injected in there as Armidale, WA for Western Australia, and that should be announced to screen reader users. Another thing is that users should be able to use the escape keystroke to close the auto-suggest list when it's open, and that also should send the focus back up to the initial input. So for example, a user starts typing and a whole bunch of suggestions come up, and none of them are what they're really wanting, so they can hit escape and then go back up to the input. So in this diagram, the escape key is shown to send focus back up to the original input. One final note on this, there are tools I've seen out there where people can also tab out of the suggest and move off the page, and the auto-suggest is left open. So nothing is that once focus has left that auto-suggest box, it's a good idea to tuck it away again and not leave it hanging out and open. And I've seen a case where there's a link below the search input, which the user could never see because the auto-suggest remained open. So you should be doing things like listening to tab keystrokes as well as arrow keystrokes and noticing if they've moved off. Now let's talk about markup for screen readers. So there's many ways we could do this, and I'm just going to give you some suggestions, and you may have a radically different way of attacking this problem. So first of all, we're going to do a quick overview of the markup needed. For this widget, we're going to start with the form element. So we have form and action, and in this case I've just put a dummy action using the hash or the pound symbol. The next elements are the label and the input elements, and they're the core of this search button and function. So we have the label and the input inside the form. Now, in this example, we've got two buttons. The first one is a clear button. You'll see we have a button, end button, and then we have a second button, which is a submit button. So there's our second button element. Then we have an unordered list, which is used to display a list of suggestions when they're appropriate. And then we have the last element is a div element, and that allows us to place some hidden instructions for screen reader users. So going top to bottom, we have our form element, and inside that we have a label, end label. We have an input. Now that doesn't have an end tag because it is a self-closing or void element. We have two button and end button elements. Tags to create two buttons. Then we have an unordered list, and in this example we've got three list items inside, and then we have a div below, all encaptured within that form element. So that's the crux of it, and now I'm going to dive into the depths of it and look at each of these. And to start with, this is very obvious now, it's been used for many years by many people, but you should use the for and ID attribute. So in order to explicitly associate the label with the input, we should use these two attributes. And in this bit of code on screen, we have label for, and then the value is search, and the input has ID search. So these two elements are now explicitly associated. Next up is the type attribute. So the input element's type attribute could be set to a range of different things, but in this case, text or search are both acceptable. So you could have, in this case, input type equals text, or input type equals search. However, it's important to consider how this clear button is going to operate. And we need to talk about some browsers that have that default search function. So if you set the input to a display of type equals search, some browsers like Chrome and Safari are going to display a native clear button at the right inside of that input. However, other browsers like Firefox don't do that. So let's look at this diagram here. We have three inputs showing Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. In Chrome and Safari, we have a little icon over at the right, and in Safari, there's no icon. So by default, not all browsers have that input clearing function. But there's something worse than that, and there's something I really don't like. More importantly, this native clear function, which is available in Chrome and Safari, can't be accessed via the tab keystroke. And the reason is because it's inside an element that already has focus. It's actually inside the input. Now that means that that function is completely inaccessible for keyboard-only users. So if you want a more robust, accessible clear button, it's better to use a separate button element like the one we've talked about earlier. Now, using CSS, you can make it clear that it actually looks like it's sitting inside, and there's a number of ways you can do that. In this diagram, I've actually put the three of them sitting beside each other, tucked tightly together, and there's a border around the input and the clear button so that they look like they're one module. But it could also be done in other ways where you position it and take it out of and give it Z-index, etc., or relative position, and move it in on top of the input. So fundamentally, it's still a separate element, but it's made to look like it's actually one element. If you're going to do that, though, you've got to make sure it's set to text rather than search. And the reason is because then you might get two little functions, one native and one that's our button. So we set it to type equals text. Next up, aria DescribeBy. So the aria DescribeBy attribute allows us to describe the purpose of the current element, and it points down to something with a matching ID. So the current element is actually the input. When a user comes into this field with focus, we need to tell them the purpose of what this actually is. And this is really important. I've seen a lot of sites. I do a lot of work with complex banking applications. And a common thing that developers will do is they'll put a function there and they'll assume that users completely understand its purpose. Now, if you're sighted, you have all these visual clues to help you understand what that search box is doing there. However, if you just come across it via tabbing to it and there's no instructions attached to it, you may have no idea the purpose of that button, that function. So the label helps to a degree. And in this case, we have search towns in Australia. So fundamentally, you should have a really good idea of what's going on. But you can use aria DescribeBy and point off to another element and give more instructions or more information. So here we have aria DescribeBy and the values instructions, and our div down the bottom has ID of instructions. So those two are now explicitly associated. Now this allows us to put basic instructions for that widget. So in this case, what we've done is the text inside that div says, when autocomplete options are available, use up and down arrows to review and enter to select. So what happens is they get to that input and it tells them search towns across Australia, and it automatically then says, when autocomplete options are available, use up and down arrows to review and enter to select. So it's giving them information about what it is and how to use the autocomplete function. Next up, you could, if you wanted, to use aria owns attribute. So the aria owns attribute allows us to define a parent and child contextual relationship. And the spec says a parent and a child contextual relationship to assistive technologies that is otherwise impossible to infer from the DOM. What does that all mean? Well, basically it means that we can define the input as a parent and the UL as the child. And because they're just sitting there side by side or one after each other, there's no way to infer that they're related from the DOM. So this allows us to give that extra bit of information. So in Markup, in the input element, we have a new attribute called aria-owns, and then we have a value of results. And the UL element, that's the list of suggestions, has an ID of results. So now the input and the UL are associated with each other as a parent and child. Next up, aria expanded. So the aria expanded attribute allows us to inform assistive technologies when that autocomplete dropdown is present or open. And it should be initially set to false, so it's not open. So when a user first approaches this and the focus goes into that input, we have aria expanded with a value of false. And as soon as they start typing and auto suggestions become available, that needs to dynamically, using JavaScript, change to true. So then the value would be aria-expanded equals true. Buttons. So as we saw before, directly after the input, we've got two different buttons. The first button is that clear button, and that's set to a type of button. So you've got button, type equals button. And the second one, because it's a submit, we're setting it to a type of submit. So in our code, we have button type equals submit. Now, if you want to use icons instead of text, that's completely acceptable. In this case, we're going to use a clear and search icons. So in this diagram, the clear button has a little, I suppose you call it like a round symbol with an X in it, which is sort of becoming the default for clear this field. And the submit button, as I mentioned before, has a little magnifying glass icon. However, if you're going to use icons instead of text, you need to provide additional context for assistive technologies. So in this case, we're going to use aria label. Now, there are many ways we could do this. My old favorite was using something off left. So you could, inside the button, you actually write some text and wrap it in a span and hide that off left. But aria label is a very simple and elegant way. So what we have is button type equals button, aria label equals clear. So that's the value that will be read out. And the second one is button type equals submit, aria label equals search, or could be submit or something like that. Next up, let's talk about the unordered list. So after these two buttons, we need this UL, which is the used to display the auto suggestions. So this is what it looks like. Now keep in mind that it should be hidden initially and then spring into action when the user starts typing. So as mentioned before, the ID attribute of results is there so that it shows that it's being owned by the parent input element. So the first attribute inside the UL is ID equals results. And that matches up to the aria owns. Now we're going to put a role in here, and this will be set with a value of list box. And that informs assistive technologies that it's a widget that allows users to select one or more items from a list of choices. So in our code, we now have ID equals results as an attribute, and then role equals list box. To make sure that element can't be brought into focus before it's triggered, we can set the tab index to -1. So tab index -1. And the reason why that sort of becomes important, it depends on the way it's being hidden. If a user comes to that element, the input, and then tabs again, and there are some suggestions below that could receive focus, you don't want the list to suddenly pop out when it shouldn't be. Highly unlikely, but still a safe way to do it is to set the tab index to -1. And of course, that should dynamically change to 0 as soon as the autocomplete suggestions are available. So tab index 0. Initially tab index -1, now tab index 0. Now to make sure that element is initially hidden, we could set the thing to display none. So now you can do this with CSS as well, but in this case, you might want to set it to display none. We could use a class instead, but just for this example, we'll use it like that. And of course, once it gets triggered, that would need to change to something like display block, so that it becomes, it's removed from the DOM and then gets placed back in the DOM in a manner of speaking. That's actually not true at all. It's a visual representation, but you know what I mean. It's not present on the page and then it becomes present on the page. Again, it could be done with CSS instead of these two values, but that's one way to do it. So the second value now says style display equals block. Initially, style display equals none. Okay, now let's talk about the list items. Each of the LI items can be given a role with a value of option, and that informs assistive technologies that is a selectable item in that select list. So each of the LIs have role equals option. The other thing is that each of them can have aria selected with an initial value of false, and that tells assistive technologies that none of them have been selected at this point. So aria selected equals false on each of the LI elements. Now, as soon as a user comes along and hits enter on them, for example, that can change to true. So then we'd have just on that item, aria selected equals true. Now, this is a very simplified piece of code. You'd probably have A elements, etc. So this is a very simple version of what would take place. Now let's talk about this sneaky hidden div sitting at the very bottom in this form. So This div, as we mentioned before, is used for instructions for assistive technologies. So it's sitting there. We have a div, and then we've got the message we had that I read out before, which was when autocomplete options are available, use up and down arrows to review and edit to select. As mentioned before, we're using the aria described attribute from above to point to this element. So we have ID equals instructions. Now this div will never be seen on screen, so it needs to be permanently hidden off screen. So the way to do that, well, there's many ways you could do that, but one way is to use some sort of off-left method where CSS is used to push it off screen so that it's still available for assistive technologies, but not seen on screen. And in this case, we're going to add a pretend class of off-left, just so we know it wouldn't be seen by normal users. Normal users? That's appalling. So we have class equals off-left. We can also set the aria live attribute, and this is really important. We're going to set it to assertive, and this informs assistive technologies as soon as something dynamic is changing in that form, in that area. So we could have aria live assertive. And why? Well, we're going to see in a second. And the reason is we need the instructions to change dynamically as soon as the autocomplete options are triggered. So in this case, what we're having is the initial message says, when autocomplete options results are available, use up and down arrows to review and enter to select. Then suddenly it will change to 6 options available, use up and down arrows to review and enter to select. So having aria live assertive allows us to change that and inform assistive technologies that this information is changing. So what's happening now is as the user is typing into the input, they're being informed of these changes in the auto suggest list below. And as they're typing, that should change as well. So it could be something like initially 3 options and then change to 6 options, depending on what's need to going on. So is there an ideal method? Is this the ideal method? As I mentioned before, this is just one method can be used, and even some of these parts of it, some people may agree with or disagree with. Fundamentally, this is not about a perfect solution. It's about a series of things that can be used to think about in order to make your auto-suggest more accessible. And of course, before deciding on everything, you should go out and check different methods and test them. If you can, test with real users, and most importantly, different people with different assistive technologies. If you can't test with real users, at least fire up a range of different assistive technologies yourself. If you're on OS X, you can use VoiceOver. If you're on Windows, you can use free things like NVDA, even if you haven't got access to JAWS. And it's so eye-opening just to test for yourself, if nothing else. But are there good examples out there? Of course. Apart from the WAI website, which has a range of suggestions, one of my favorite is called the Halter's web version. And I put a link here, and we can tweet it out later if people are interested in. But that I found when doing testing was quite a robust one, and it met a lot of not only the accessibility needs, but it was also had some really nice UI. But there are a wide range of other ones, and I've put a list of them there. Interestingly, some of them are very good, and some of them don't quite match some of the UX needs. I think, as an example, and I'm going to slur the good name of Vision Australia, but their example, while quite accessible, had that problem I mentioned before where it doesn't matter what you type in there, it would just automatically pop open the 6 options that it wanted to present to you. So if you type something, it's going to pop open a list and say, I haven't got what you want, but here's 6 things to think about. So that could probably be massaged slightly to suit your needs. Anyway, there you have it. A range of things to discuss, and hopefully I haven't offended you too deeply. I'm done.
Hello, Russ. Thank you very much. That's a great presentation. Very, very practical and a lot of good advice there. But I think one thing we note about it is that a lot of your advice can apply to a lot of different situations. So, for example, the advice on visible focus, on keyboard handling. Could you perhaps talk a little bit about that? How you might take the advice in this presentation and apply it to other situations?
Yeah. So one of the jobs I do is sort of weird. I'm not an accessibility reviewer per se. So I don't go and do audits on websites like a lot of accessibility professionals. What I often do is sit in with teams on complex applications and work with developers to help them make it more accessible. And then it goes out to audit with accessibility professionals. So my role is often to sit with developers and help them make things more accessible. And so yes, one of the most easy tests that you can sit with a developer and do is just open up a keyboard only and tab through it. Number one, can you do everything with keyboard only? And number two, can you see where you are? And I've often been amazed that some developers are far smarter than I am, but they just literally hadn't thought of either of those two incredibly simple tests. Can I use this application or this widget completely with keyboard only? And when I'm using it, can I always see what's in focus? And watching them sit beside me or getting them to do it and saying, just tab through that and see how it goes. And just the realization on their faces when they go, right. And then to be able to say to them, do you realize this is one of the biggest audiences in the accessibility community that has needs? So not only is it people with a range of physical difficulties, but also screen reader users, etc. So it takes into account a very, very broad spectrum. If you haven't got if you've built a widget that literally can't be used with a keyboard, you're alienating a vast number of those users.
Yeah, that's very true. It's sort of it's one of those things that you can get a lot of improvement. We talked about in I think the previous session about making small changes that have an impact, so improving things over time, and that's one of those things that can make a disproportionate impact, I think.
Yeah, there's another thing as well, just while we're talking about that. I'm slightly obsessed with where focus goes, and I know that sounds very strange, but in a lot of cases, even when developers they get something to work, they don't think about what happens when something is triggered. And I'll give you a number of quick examples. I worked on a very complex banking application which had the spawn of Satan, which is commonly called a modal. So the user would fire up a modal and they would change their banking account details. And then when they hit close, they would be taken down to the page, back to the page. So the key question is, where do they go? Where do you send them? Where do you send focus once the modal's closed? Now, this was, as you'd imagine, a really complex banking application. And what was happening is they were sending focus back to the top of the page. Now, I was sitting in there hours and hours a day testing in a screen reader. And even for me, that was horrifyingly frustrating because it would take you 5 solid minutes tabbing and listening through the page to get to that button which said, change my banking details. You'd fire up the modal, change the banking details, and instead of being taken straight back down next to that button or on that button, you were shot to the top of the page again. So that's one example of just really poor thought about where focus goes. Another much simpler example is, I was just working on something the other day where a developer had built a simple method for adding a row into a table. So, for example, you want to add a new bank account and you wanted to, when you hit plus or add, it would add a new row and an input would appear and you can add your bank details for that, for that account. But here's the thing, the add button was at the bottom of the table. And so if you hit add for adding a new row, the row would be injected above the button and the focus would stay on the button. So you probably immediately see the problem here. What was happening is I was watching a blind user and they'd hit enter on the button, a new row would be added, but they weren't informed about it at all. And so they'd hit add it again. And I watched them just punching in, 5 or 6 extra rows before realizing something was going on. And that could be changed and was eventually with one tiny change. As soon as the user hit add, focus shifted to that row. And immediately they get announced that, add your bank details. So tiny little things that allow users to understand when you shift focus. And one final other one is on a modal or things like that. Or a probably better one would be like on a tab panel. If you've got an in-page tabs, when users are tabbing from the tab above, I'd like to send them to the panel itself and put an aria label or something there, so that they actually get to an element that can receive focus and then give some instructions about it as well. So I'm slightly obsessed with where focus goes once a user triggers something. Sorry for that long rave.
No, it's good to hear. I'm also obsessed slightly about this. It's one of the things I spent a lot of time trying to think about when developing a new pattern. But you also talked about how seeing a screen reader user, blind screen reader user, struggling with it was one of the things that prompted you to do something with it. And this is something you mentioned in your talk as well, that just using a keyboard yourself to navigate something can tell you so much. But I think if you do get the possibility of seeing real users use your website, it's so invaluable, and you should always take up any offer to do so.
Yeah, there is one caveat to that, and I completely agree with you. It's eye-opening. You get insights that you, even as a professional, like there's a lot of things, you're probably the same when you're working on a lot of applications, you pick up things very quickly that you know are going to be problems. But when you see real users, they eke out those funny little situations that you may not have thought of. But one caveat on that I would say is that if you are going to do it, try and do more than one user and listen to what these various users are saying. And what I'm trying to say here is that one user may have a very specific stance on something. So I work closely with a guy called Andrew Downey. He's like an advanced screen reader user. Like he's actually a blind user, but a developer. So he is very, very sophisticated in his understanding not only of how screen readers work, but how websites work. And so he is quite anti providing too much information. So if something, I love giving a bit of extra information to screen reader users when they receive focus and things like that. And he has a tolerance for that to a certain degree. But after that, he gets very upset. It's far too much information. However, I was working on a banking application, and the primary blind user there wanted all the things dripping with information. So the banking application ended up being really verbose. And so what you had is two very different opinions on, for one user, this was really helpful. For another user like Andrew, it was incredibly irritating. So very important to test with a range of users, but also to be aware that you may need to take on board their opinions and, massage them or, leave them at certain points, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this is, if you're not familiar with the process, this is where the value of a specialist company comes in as well. That not only are you paying for the recruitment and organization of your testing, but you're also often the value is in working with people who are good at interpreting results, so that they can tell where things are a personal preference rather than an actual maybe mainstream and broadly applicable suggestion.
That's a really good way to put it. I love what you just said. There's a personal opinion. Like every human has it. Everyone has their own opinions and their own biases. And exactly right. You need to be able to look at I do user testing a lot with ranges of different users. And in any user testing scenario, that has to be the filter. You have to be able to look at something and say, oh, that is a problem. Or to be able to look at that and say, yeah, look, I see what you're saying, but that is, heavily biased based on personal opinion. So you've got to be able to weigh those sort of things up. So yeah, I completely agree.
Okay, so that's really great, Russ. Really good practical advice. I'm here with Henny Swan, who's been monitoring Twitter during the presentation. Henny?
Yeah, Russ, just to say thank you very much, and also great discussion afterwards as well. And just to add to that analysing results thing, I think we also need to be brave and know that when we get inconclusive results, it's as long as it is sort of basically accessible, it's okay to leave it for a while and get user feedback via comments, stats tracking potentially as well. But yes, I've been looking at Twitter, and
Does anyone want to sue me?
Sorry?
Does anyone want to sue me?
Yeah, loads of people. But that aside, we have a comment from Manuel Matsuzovic, who said, just listen to the first ID24 talk by Aaron Gustafsson about HTML, and I'm amazed by how much new stuff I learned, which I think is a lovely comment, really. I think, I'm learning stuff today, which is great. I've learned stuff from you, Russ. And it's a reminder as well that if you feel the need to go and have a nap, then by all means you can catch these talks catch up on our YouTube channel, which I will be tweeting just after this segment. So you will get a Jules license coming towards you soon, Manuel.
Thank you, Henny. So once again, a reminder that ID24 is brought to you by the Paciello Group and with kind support from Barclays and the Centre for Inclusive Design in Australia. And you can find out more about those organisations on our website. If you like this session, please hit the like button and subscribe to the ID24 channel for future events. We have more plans for this, and the best way to be notified of this is to subscribe. So thank you very much once again, Russ. We will be back at the top of the hour with our next presentation. Thank you very much.